Yeah. Today, 24th August, is the anniversary of Ukraine's independence. It's Ukraine's Independence Day. There's been a lot of discussion about this in the media, and there were wide expectations stoked up by a very heavy, shall we say, publicizing in some quarters of certain comments made by the Russian ambassador to the US, Ambassador Antonov, that there would be some sort of massive Russian missile attack across Ukraine. I've seen no sign of that. And as I've said many times, I have been completely unable to recall a single instance when the Russians have taken any military step that is in any way aligned with particular dates on the calendar. As far as I can see, Russian military operations continue at their own rhythm and at their own pace, and events on the national calendar of any country, including Russia itself, have no bearing on it. I think there will be further massive Russian missile strikes at some point. They haven't happened for a while, not on the scale that we have seen in the past, most probably because the Russians have carried out massive damage on Ukraine's energy system and its industrial capacity. They probably used up lots and lots of missiles doing so. They're probably building up their missile arsenal, stockpiling missiles, and I'm going to make a guess that we're going to see a resumption of the missile war against Ukraine sometime in the autumn, in conjunction with the next part of Russia's big offensive, the one that will happen after the fall of Pokrovsk, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, and all of these other places. A missile offensive which possibly might coincide with the final and conclusive Russian offensive of the war. But in the meantime, as I said, I don't think that the Russians are going to let themselves be hurried or are going to fritter away their resources making token steps on Ukrainian Independence Day. As for the Ukrainians, there have been lots of reports about all kinds of things that the Ukrainians might be intending to do, attacks on the Kinburn Spit and other places at the mouth of the Dnieper River. This was reported by the Russians yesterday. There are claims this morning that the Ukrainians are again assembling a force of 4 brigades to launch an attack towards Tokmak in Zaporozhye region. I cannot for the life of me understand the logic of that. The Ukrainians have themselves published a map giving us the relative dispositions of the Russian forces along the line of contact. And it is, by the way, extremely interesting and very suggestive indeed, because what it shows, for one thing, is where the heaviest concentrations of Russian troops are to be found. And it turns out that Russian forces in Dnieper, and in other words, in Kherson region, the Russian group of forces Dnieper, commanded, by the way, by one of the most capable of Russian generals, General Teplinsky, who is also the head of Russia's airborne forces. Anyway, group of forces Dnieper, the force that is defending Kherson region, is by far the biggest, according to the Ukrainians, with 130,000 men in total. There are also a further 13,500 troops in Crimea itself, by the way. Now, I cannot conceive of any situation where 4 Ukrainian brigades, we are looking at perhaps 20,000 men, putting a very optimistic spin on this, can prevail over a Russian force which, according to the Ukrainians, numbers 130,000 and which can still rely on the massive defences that were created in the winter of 2022-2023, the Surovikin line. So if the Ukrainians want to launch that sort of an attack, well, no doubt they can try. Maybe they will be able to recapture the old village. But 100 armoured vehicles, which is the figures that I've been hearing about, a number of them tanks, plus 4 brigades. I cannot comprehend what it could do against a force of this size. Just saying. And bear in mind that the Ukrainians are short of men and machines everywhere, right across the front lines. This Ukrainian map, by the way, is very interesting. Of course, all comes from Ukrainian sources, but I suspect that this originates in the Ukrainian General Staff. General Syrskyi, for the record, has been providing a lot of information recently about losses and troop dispositions on the battlefronts. He's just, by the way, been promoted from Colonel General to General by President Zelensky, which is probably a sign that Zelensky is pleased with the offensive in Kursk that Syrskyi masterminded. We'll come to all that in a moment. But anyway, Syrskyi has provided a lot of information, and if we look at where the bulk of the Russian forces are, we have 130,000 troops in Kherson region, 13,500 troops in Crimea, that is the smallest force, 52,000 troops with group of forces Vostok. They are the troops who've been fighting in the Vremivka salient and places like that. They've been on the offensive recently, and they're pushing the Ukrainians back there. But then we have the big forces concentrated in central and northern Donbass. Group of forces center, the force commanded by General Mordvichev, the force that is pushing towards Pokrovsk, that numbers 87,000. Group of forces south, 114,000, bigger still, but it's taking steps to support Group of Forces Center in its attacks on Pokrovsk, and it's also taking care of the fighting in places like Krasnogorivka and further south around Konstantinovka and Vuhledar. So this has to be, by definition, a very large formation. And then there's also a group of forces west with 71,500 men, which is the force attacking in Chasiv Yar and around Siversk. Group of forces north, which is attacking in Kharkiv and defending in Kursk, according to this information provided by the Ukrainians, numbers in total, some 73,500 men. Now, these are Ukrainian figures. Let me stress again, they should be taken with a major cascade of salt. One doesn't know exactly how strong they are, but the Ukrainians say that the total number of forces that the Russians now have on the front lines are 541,600. They said that the Russian forces at the start of the year were around 440,000. There's apparently another 100,000 Russian troops held back in reserve, and the Ukrainians expect that Russian forces will grow in size to around 800,000 by the end of the year. Now, this is information that is coming from the Ukrainians. As to the total size of the Ukrainian forces, I'm going to say straight away that we have nothing like the same detailed information, but I've seen suggestions that it's probably the fighting forces probably number between 300,000 and 400,000. So the Russians have an advantage in numbers. Numerically, maybe not a decisive advantage if you treat every soldier on the Russian side as no better the equal of every soldier on the Ukrainian side, which is almost certainly wrong, by the way. The Russians do, however, have a massive preponderance in artillery, in shells, in aircraft, in all sorts of things, and by the way, also in drones. And that partly explains the balance, the shift in the forces that we're seeing. But, of course, and this may be what is driving the Ukrainians to take the increasingly reckless gambles that they're taking, gambles like the Kursk operation. The Ukrainians have told us that they expect the Russian forces to number around 800,000 by the end of the year. At that point, the Russians will, of course, have an overall 2-to-1 superiority, combined with a massive preponderance in equipment, and frankly, the preponderance that the Russians will have on their side will be so enormous that I can't imagine that anyone in Kiev believes that Ukraine can withstand the kind of avalanche that would likely be launched against it around the end of the year. So that almost certainly explains some of these very reckless actions, extraordinary actions that the Ukrainians have been taking over the last few days and weeks. The Kursk operation, the attempt to capture Kurchatov and the Kursk nuclear power plant, that is what I believe the Ukrainian plan was. That is what the Russians believe the Ukrainian plan was. The Russians have said as much. The various drone attacks that Ukraine has been trying to conduct against Russian bases, including air bases. There's been satellite pictures which apparently show some damage in one particular air base. Claims that Russian Sukhoi 34s have been destroyed. I cannot for the life of me make any sense of these satellite pictures, and I've learned to take even satellite pictures now with some care, just saying. But whatever is happening there, it's going to be nowhere near enough, these drone attacks, nowhere near enough to offset Russian advantages. The Ukrainians, as I said, destroyed another ferry, perhaps the last ferry, linking Crimea with the Russian mainland, if you like. But of course, ferries like this have little relevance any longer. Ukraine has not so far succeeded in destroying the Crimean Bridge, which is still apparently in daily operation, not used any longer to send military supplies, apparently, but all the other foodstuffs and things that Crimea needs. And of course, the railways that the Russians have built to access Crimea from their own interior, which pass along the land bridge, they're apparently operational. So destroying ferries may look dramatic. It hits what are vulnerable targets, but the military relevance of these attacks, again, really isn't that great. Now, I said that Syrskyi has provided a whole swathe of further information, and some of it is very interesting and stands as an important corrective on what the Ukrainians have been telling us about things in the past. So, those of us who have been following the missile war and the energy and electricity war have become used to the Ukrainians making all sorts of claims that they've been shooting down vast numbers of Russian missiles. They regularly claim that around 90% of the missiles, 90% plus of the Russian missiles that have been launched against Ukraine have been shot down by Ukraine's air defences. Well, the latest information provided by General Syrski has drastically scaled that claim down. It seems that the actual number of missiles that the Ukrainians have shot down is proportionately no more than around 29%. And the Russians apparently have lost a significant number of their apparently the Ukrainians have been successful, I should say, let me put it like this, they've been successful in shooting down the KH-101 missiles. That's where they claim the greatest success. They say that around 78% of those missiles were shot down. But in terms of all of the others, the ballistic missiles, the KH-22s, 32s, the hypersonic missiles, the Kinzhals and the Zircons, all of those Russian losses have been much lower. The vast majority of the missiles have got through. As to hypersonic missiles, whether the Ukrainians have actually managed to shoot any of them down, I think is debatable, but I'm not going to argue the point. I suspect that even these corrected figures that Syrski has provided are exaggerated. They still exaggerate the overall success of Ukraine's air defense system. So, Russian missile strikes turns out much more effective than the Ukrainians were telling us. Anyway, the Ukrainians are also saying that the Russians are currently firing around 45,000 munitions per day, as against Ukrainians' 15,000 munitions a day. Like Simplicius the thinker, I doubt that these are artillery shells. I suspect that this covers the whole range of ground-based firepower, rockets from multiple launch rocket systems, mortars, that sort of thing. But even there, I suspect the Russians, in terms of artillery, have a massive advantage. And I suspect that this figure of 45,000 for the Russians, 15,000 for the Ukrainians, has been provided, counting in all of these other munitions, to make Ukrainian firing rates look better than they are. I suspect when it comes to artillery, and specifically to 155mm artillery, the Ukrainians are actually firing far fewer shells than they want to disclose. I've seen some suggestions that it's now down to 2,000 or 3,000 shells a day, as opposed to 10,000 plus 152mm shells fired by the Russians. Anyway, all very interesting and very suggestive. But there we go. I don't think, as I said, that the 24th of August is an important day in the Russian military calendar. I think it is just another day. And the Russians do not have to do anything dramatic on this particular day, because they are continuing to advance, as we shall see, in Ukraine. Anyway, the actual gains the Russians are achieving on the ground are dramatic enough without them needing in any way to make some big display or big show in some other manner. Now, before I talk about the situation on the ground, I'm going to touch on the visit of Prime Minister Modi to Ukraine. He's just visited Ukraine. The meeting was fairly short. He went to Poland first, had a meeting with the Polish government, President Duda and Prime Minister Tusk. He then presumably took the train to Kiev. He was, by the way, followed by the Polish president, President Duda, who is also, I believe, in Kiev now, and that's going to be an interesting discussion. Ukraine and Poland have just faced accusations from the German legal authorities that they were in some way in collusion with each other over the Nord Stream attacks. And there's some suggestions that President Duda might have had a personal role in the Nord Stream attacks. So maybe the reason that Duda has rushed to Kiev is because he wants to discuss with the Ukrainians how they are going to respond to these German moves. Just saying. But anyway, in some respects, the meeting that some people thought might be the more important, the meeting that might result in big changes, or perhaps a change of stance, was the visit by Prime Minister Modi of India to Kiev. And he went there. I believe that he was there for a relatively short time, perhaps 1 or maybe 2 days. He met with Indian students in Kiev. He laid a wreath at a statue in Kiev of Mahatma Gandhi. I believe that was, by the way, constructed during the Soviet era, just saying. He also apparently attended some kind of scientific center. The Indian Foreign Ministry's readout of Modi's meeting with Zelensky was extremely brief. So brief, in fact, that I don't think there's any real point in reading it. But the two leaders, the two countries, Zelensky and Modi, India and Ukraine, did publish a joint statement. And the statement is fairly long, and it covers many topics, though in a relatively vague way: economic cooperation, cultural cooperation, Indian participation in summit meetings in India and in a dialogue launched by India, a lot of that kind of thing. But about the conflict, the ongoing conflict, it doesn't say a huge amount. Anyway, this is what the joint statement said: ensuring a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. Prime Minister Modi and President Zelensky reiterated their readiness for further cooperation in upholding principles of international law, including the UN Charter, such as respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. They agreed on the desirability of closer bilateral dialogue in this regard. Note that the expression respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of states is expressed in general terms. There is no reference here, for example, specifically to the question of territorial integrity of Ukraine itself. Then the statement goes on to say the Indian side reiterated its principal position, which it doesn't set out, on peace and focus on peaceful resolution through dialogue and diplomacy, as a part of which India attended the summit on peace in Ukraine held in Burgenstock, Switzerland in June 2024. That was the peace summit. But of course, India didn't sign the final communique, and the Indian Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, did not attend, as I understand, and nor did Modi himself. But anyway, the Indians were there, and that's something that this statement mentions. And then the statement goes on to say the Ukrainian side welcomed such participation by India and highlighted the importance of high-level Indian participation in the next peace summit. The Ukrainian side conveyed that the joint communique on a peaceful framework adopted at the summit on peace in Ukraine could serve as a basis for further efforts to promote just peace based on dialogue, diplomacy, and international law. That is a very interesting paragraph because that expresses the view of the Ukrainian side. The Indian side's opinions on this question are not mentioned. India, of course, did not sign the joint communique. Just to repeat again, the statement that goes on to say the leaders appreciated various efforts to ensure global food security, including Ukrainian humanitarian grain initiative, the importance of uninterrupted and unhindered supply of agricultural products to global markets, especially in Asia and Africa, was emphasized. This has indeed been a major Indian concern. India obviously needs stable food prices. It's a country which is very affected by shifts in the price of food. So do many countries in Asia and Africa, as the statement correctly says. The reason why the Russians have held off from imposing any kind of restrictions on exports of Ukrainian grain, though I think that they did ponder that possibility last year, was not because the Ukrainians and their British and American friends managed to inflict some great defeat on the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Russians have ample means, if they wanted, to impose an effective blockade on Ukrainian ports like Odessa, for example, or to interfere with grain ships in the Black Sea. It is because the Russians realized that if they took steps like that, they would meet with strong disapproval from their friends in India and Africa. I remember that there was an African delegation that came to Moscow and had a meeting with Putin. The Africans made very clear that they wanted to see food supplies, food exports from Ukraine as well as Russia continue unhindered. Putin tried to talk them round by talking about free supplies of Russian grain, but it became very clear that though they were happy to accept the free supplies of Russian grain, they still wanted unrestricted exports of food from Ukraine. So that is an important point. It's one the Russians have noted and have acted upon, and for that reason, this is no longer, in truth, a serious issue. And then the last section, which tells us what the Indians themselves think. Prime Minister Modi reiterated the need for sincere and practical engagement between all stakeholders to develop innovative solutions that will have broad acceptability and contribute towards early restoration of peace. He reiterated India's willingness to contribute in all possible ways to facilitate an early return of peace. Now, that tells us again that the Indians want to see a return to peace in Ukraine, which is, of course, what they have always said. But notice the complicated language. Prime Minister Modi reiterated the need for sincere and practical engagement by all stakeholders to develop innovative solutions that will have broad acceptability and contribute towards early restoration of peace. What does that exactly mean? Who are the stakeholders? What does he mean by innovative solutions? What is the issue of broad acceptability? Now, I'm going to suggest what I think it means. I think what Modi is probably talking about, and here I suspect he was a lot more forthright in private than this statement says, is that he's telling the Ukrainians, look, you've got to understand that the Russians have security concerns. These center on your push to enter NATO. You and the Western powers who support you must be prepared to drop that. And in terms of security guarantees for Ukraine, yes, certainly you should have those. but they cannot be of a sort that the Russians would find threatening. And the fact that it refers to stakeholders suggests that the Western powers are being partly addressed in these statements, in this comment, and the fact that there is a reference to innovative solutions suggests to me that the Indians are saying that you must address Russian security concerns by embracing ideas that you have so far resisted. It's complicated language, and when two leaders use complicated language in a statement, that strongly suggests that there are differences. Notice that this part of the statement reflects things which only Prime Minister Modi has said. And of course, the next statement, India's willingness to contribute in all possible ways to facilitate an early return to peace, does hold out the possibility of India perhaps one day taking a more active role, perhaps becoming a mediator, not for the moment, but eventually. But clearly, that is conditional on there being sincere and practical engagement between all stakeholders to develop innovative solutions that will have broad acceptability and contribute towards early restoration of peace. Now, I've analysed this meeting, this statement rather more detailed than perhaps some have done. Overall, I come back to my view about Modi's visit. Modi was severely criticised in the West and by the Ukrainians themselves for his embrace of Putin during his visit to Russia shortly after Modi was re-elected Prime Minister of India. And of course, the Indians and the Russians came up with an enormous series of documents and comprehensive agreements, far more detailed than what has come out of this joint statement. The level of cooperation between Russia and India is of an entirely different scale than anything that you will see set out in the statement that Modi and Zelensky have both signed off on. And, well, Modi came in for criticism because of that. So he came to Ukraine basically as a fence-mending measure, wanting to keep the Americans to some extent off his back. But this is the key point. Coming to Kiev, he appears to have said nothing that would cause the Russians any significant difficulty or concern. It's a skillful balancing act that Modi and India have repeatedly and successfully pulled off, and they've managed it again. Now, saying that, I have to say that I think the time, the degree to which Modi and India can continue to play this game of running, as we say in Britain, simultaneously with both the hare and the hounds might possibly be coming towards an end. I don't think that the Americans are happy about any of this. I think that we've seen increasing moves by the US to put pressure on India. We saw this with the restrictions on Russian diamond exports, which are apparently now impacting on the Indian diamond cutting industry, which is based very much, incidentally, in Modi's home state. We see that, I said at the time, by the way, that was a sanction more directed against Modi and India than ultimately against Russia. And it is having an effect. We have the events in Bangladesh, which again were a shot across the bows of the Indians, as well as being all sorts of other things. We've had the criticism of Modi during the recent election campaign. We've had the criticisms of Modi at the last G20 meeting in Delhi, and the bringing up in advance of that meeting of the claims about assassination attempts by Indian security officials of Sikh separatist leaders in Canada and the United States. So we see that the pressure on Modi is there, and on India is there, and probably it will continue to increase. But for the moment, India is playing its game with skill. Modi is playing his game with considerable skill. He went to Kiev, he signed off on a joint statement. The joint statement appeared to confirm that India is not taking sides in the conflict, but all the commitments that were made in that statement would not have put India's relations with Russia under any sort of stress. Notice, by the way, that nowhere in this joint statement that Zelensky and Modi signed off on is there any mention of Russia at all. Russia is never named. There's a discussion about a conflict and about achieving peace, but there is never any mention as to who the other party to that conflict is. And that tells you again how limited the move towards Ukraine was, the one that Modi was prepared to make over the course of this visit. Anyway, let's move on and let's talk about the current situation in Ukraine. And I'm going to say straight away that the big news continues to be what is happening in the Donbass battlefronts. And perhaps the most important news relates to the situation around Pokrovsk. And here, things are accelerating very, very fast. Firstly, there are reports this morning, I can't confirm them, but they are all over the place, that the Ukrainians have now completely withdrawn from the village of Grodivka. That following the Russian capture of the two villages of Krasny Yar and Kruty Yar, the Ukrainian defenders in Grodivka realized that they were at serious risk of becoming completely encircled, and therefore they decided to withdraw. And immediately prior to that information, there was further information that the Russians had already, by this point, achieved control of 80% of Grodivka. Now, if this is true, then it is likely that today, Grodivka, the last important village on the road to Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, will have passed under Russian control. That will happen today. There is also a lot of information coming through about the presence of Russian troops in Novogrodivka. Now, there was a lot of talk a couple of days ago that the Russians would find it very difficult to break through into Novogrodivka, that there was the coal mines and the slag heaps lying to the east of Novogrodivka. That doesn't seem to have had any effect whatsoever. The Russians have clearly maneuvered either between and through these coal mines and slag heaps, or they've rapidly captured them. I don't know which it is. But the fact is that there's no doubt now at all that there is considerable fighting taking place inside Novogrodivka. There was a report this morning that the Russians control 25% of Novogrodivka. This is a more built-up area than some of the other places that we've been talking about. It could be more than that. There's also reports that the Russians have begun an attack and might even have captured the village of Marinivka, which lies to the south of Novogrodivka, between Novogrodivka and Selidovo. And anyway, the Russians are very close to capturing Novogrodivka itself. If the Russians capture both Grodivka and Novogrodivka, Novogrodivka, by the way, I suspect being a Soviet creation, created maybe to balance Grodivka a little further north. The Soviets were very into that kind of thing. Well, if that has happened, then the situation for the Ukrainians is going to be not just catastrophic in terms of the Pokrovsk area, but existential and quite possibly terminal. It would seem to me that the Russians, if they control Novogrodivka, Marinka, Nikolivka to the south, apparently they're pushing towards capturing Mikhailivka, which is on the MO4 highway to Karlovka in the south. And they're also supposedly pushing south from Ptikhe towards another village, Kalinovo, which is also just north of this same highway. The Russians capture all of these places within the next couple of hours or days. Then it seems to me that Selidovo's days are probably numbered, and numbered literally in days. I think that the Russians would be able to begin a storming operation of Selidovo very quickly. And if the Russians consolidate control of Grodivka, it is likely that they will move, I think, fairly rapidly to clear the villages to the north of Grodivka and to the east of Mirnograd. In other words, they will close the great highway from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka, the main supply road. I think that will happen fairly quickly, and maybe we will start to see the assault on Mirnograd itself begin, maybe as soon as the beginning of next week. Just saying, these are guesses. I'm not saying this will happen. The Russian staff does not share its plans with me, as I have pointed out many times, and it could be that the Russians will want to pause and regroup and bring up more forces before they do begin an assault on Mirnograd and Pokrovsk. I'm going to guess, however, that the Russians probably will want to move fairly quickly in this area. And the reason they will want to do that is because they do appear to have a numerical superiority. The Ukrainian defenses apparently are weak, and the Russians may calculate that if they begin a storming operation of Pokrovsk right away, they can probably capture Pokrovsk and Mirnograd and all of those places before the Ukrainians are able to establish stable defenses. And of course, if Pokrovsk is captured by the Russians in that manner, well, then Ukraine will face a catastrophic situation in Donbass, their main supply route to their main forces further east in Toretsk, in Konstantinovka, in Chasiv Yar, in Kramatorsk will be cut off. There is the other road through Kharkiv region. Apparently, it is not such a stable road. It's not such a good road. It's not such an important supply route as the route from Dnipro through Pavlograd and Pokrovsk has been. And of course, going back to what was said by the Ukrainian MP, Marina Bezuglaya, once the Russians consolidate control of Pokrovsk, they can move along the same highway westwards towards Pavlograd. And of course, if they capture Pavlograd and she says that Pavlograd is undefended, then the Russians can move on and capture Dnipro as well. Well, move on to the Dnieper. Maybe they won't capture Dnipro. That might be too much. But they can move on to the Dnieper and arrive opposite Dnipro. And that will be, for the Ukrainians, an existential moment, as I have discussed many times. So, events moving very rapidly in the Pokrovsk area. As I said, it looks like Grodivka may be about to fall today. Novogrodivka, perhaps a couple of days still. Attack on Selidovo, likely to begin before very long. And with Grodivka captured, and perhaps other villages like Novoekonomichke and Vozvezhenka, perhaps also captured by the Russians. The road already cut, the main supply road already cut, and the Russians in a position to attack Mirnograd and Pokrovsk. So, a crisis situation for the Ukrainians, and one which for the moment they not only seem unable to get on top of, but which, as Bezuglaya correctly said, they don't seem to have any kind of plan for. It's not clear what exactly it is that the Ukrainians are thinking of doing about any of these problems. Anyway, further east, there's been more information about the situation in Toretsk. It seems that the Russians not only have cleared the area of the high-rise buildings in the northeast of Toretsk, but they have also broken into Toretsk from the southwest, so that there are now two Russian forces converging on the central part of Toretsk. A couple of days ago, the Russian newspaper Regatta published a discussion of how Russian operations might be conducted in Toretsk. They suggested that the Russians would capture Druzhba, the village of Druzhba, which the Russians do indeed seem to be in the process of capturing, that the Russians would then capture the high-rise building area. They have apparently successfully done that, and that they would advance from that area into the central part of Toretsk, as Radovka put it, fragmenting Ukrainian defenses in Toretsk. Well, the Russians have done exactly what Radovka said, but they have also said something that Radovka thought they would probably not do, which is attack Toretsk from the south. Radovka thought that would be too complex and difficult an operation because of the fortifications that existed there, and that the attack on Toretsk would take the shape of just this one advance from the east. Well, it's turning out otherwise. The Russians launch pincer attacks when they seek to capture large locations. They did this in Bakhmut, they did this in Mariupol, they did this in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, they did this also in Bakhmut, as I remember, and Avdiivka. So this is the usual Russian pattern: attack from more than one direction, storm a place from multiple directions at the same time, and that appears to be what is playing out in Toretsk. I think that the fall of Toretsk is, as the Ukrainian MP Bezuglaya said, probably just weeks, or maybe even a week or two away. It looks to me as if in Toretsk we're seeing the Battle of Avdiivka play out at very high speed. It's astonishing to think that this operation in the Toretsk area, Toretsk, New York area, supposedly one of the most heavily fortified positions of the Ukrainian army throughout the whole of Donbass, that this operation only began as recently as June, and we're seeing it play out as rapidly as we have done. Nowhere does one get the sense of the weakening of the Ukrainian armed forces caused by 2 years of attrition, though we see it in Toretsk. And in the meantime, there's been more news about further Russian advances inside Chasiv Yar. I saw a report yesterday, again talking about various streets in central Chasiv Yar that the Russians have now taken possession of. I'm not going to pretend that I know the full details, but I'm going to make a guess that Chasiv Yar also will probably collapse. Defences in Chasiv Yar will probably collapse at roughly the same time as Toretsk also collapses. Now, just to make a point here, Chasiv Yar is a small place, roughly 13,000 people by my understanding. Toretsk at 30,000 people, much bigger place, similar in size to Avdiivka itself. So a small town, Toretsk, like Avdiivka, but a significantly bigger town than Chasiv Yar. The Russians will have to move a shorter distance, if you wish, and capture fewer places to capture Chasiv Yar than they would if they needed to capture Toretsk. So there we go. Rapid collapse of the Ukrainian forces in this area. And of course, if the supply roads are cut, then that collapse will hasten because the Ukrainian forces in Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, if the road from Pokrovsk is cut, are going to be left with less equipment, less ammunition, fewer reinforcements, fewer supplies, and their position will become very critical. So, major crisis there. Again, I don't think it is necessary to discuss the importance of the fall of these three places, Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar. I've discussed it in many programs. Bezeglaya talked about it. Others also have done so. Frankly, if these three places are captured by the Russians, the spine of Ukrainian defenses in Donbass will be broken, and then it will be simply a case of the Russians completing the battle for the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, which, in my opinion, the Ukrainians will lack the operational space or the secure lines of communication to defend. And that now brings us to what's going on the northern battle lines. And I'm going to start with what's going on in Kharkiv region, because here we have information from our old friends at Group of Forces North. And I'm going to discuss first what Group of Forces North is telling us about the situation in Volchansk. They said that in the Volchansk direction, fighting continues in Volchansk. In the area of multi-story buildings, assault groups our assault groups are conducting counterfights for control over the block. The enemy is trying to hold his positions at any cost and is transferring reinforcements, artillery, and reinforcements. Our artillery and drones are working on them. Up to 17 Ukrainian troops have been destroyed in 24 hours. So they're suggesting that they're continuing their advance in Volchansk. They also say that in Lipsy, in the area of Lipsy, the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack Gluboka, up to 30 troops and 3 armoured personnel carriers. The advance was detected by Group of Forces reconnaissance. 2 armoured personnel carriers were destroyed on the approaches to the settlement. The third one disappeared. And overall, they saying that the situation, in other words, in Volchansk, in Kharkiv, continues to go in their favor. It's a long, grueling battle in Volchansk. Some of Ukraine's best troops are concentrated in Kharkiv region and in Kursk, as we will come to shortly. But steadily, day by day, the Russians are making progress. Now, the former Russian appointed governor of the Russian-controlled areas of Kharkiv region has made a lament about Volchansk. He said that when the Russians previously controlled Volchansk in 2022, it was a stable, well-run community. He said that it is now being destroyed. This is probably true because the battle for Volchansk is so intense. But to make the point once again, if the Russians succeed in capturing Volchansk, or rather when they do, then all of these very complicated operations that have been taking place south of Kupiansk, in the area of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, where the Russians have been steadily capturing villages and have reached the rivers in several places and have crossed the Zherebets river and the fighting for the village of Makevka. All of that will suddenly become very important. At that point, the Russians will be able to start advancing towards Kupiansk, and their next objective will surely in that case be to cut the main road, the other main supply road, supplying Ukrainian forces in Donbass, the one that passes through Kharkiv region, the one that the Ukrainians will be relying on exclusively once the bigger supply road from Pokrovsk is finally cut. Now, that then brings me to the one remaining area where the Ukrainians continue to be active, and that is, of course, Kursk region. And there's been a huge amount written and said about Kursk region. Many people appear to see Kursk region still imply that what has happened in Kursk region has somehow been a blow or an embarrassment to the Russians. I think it's important to stress again that from Putin's point of view, from the point of view of the Russian authorities, the official Russian authorities, fighting in Kursk region is obviously fighting in Russia, but they consider Donbass now and Zaporozhye and Kherson region to be Russia also. So this is not quite the great qualitative change that some people, I think, seem to think from a Russian point of view that it is. The Russians have been fighting in what they consider to be Russia for a long time now, since the four regions became officially Russian territory in September 2022. Just saying, as I said, I repeat, it's a point which I understand people in the West don't understand, because they tend to see all of this territory still as Ukrainian. It's also the case that some of Putin's critics, particularly the very hardline nationalistic critics, the admirers of Yevgeny Prigozhin, I noticed that many of the websites that have been critical of Russian response to the Kursk operation, Russian Telegram channels and websites that have been critical of the Russian conduct of the Kursk operation, have been lauding the memory of Yevgeny Prigozhin, whose death took place almost exactly a year ago. Just saying. But anyway, they don't seem to want to grasp that this distinction that they too are making between Kursk as Russian territory and Donbass as Russian territory, from an official Russian perspective, from the perspective also of the General Staff in Moscow, which is making its operational plans, simply doesn't exist anymore. Anyway, let's move on and discuss what Group of Forces North is telling us about the situation in Kursk region. They say that fierce fighting is unfolding near the settlement of Malaya Lochnia. Now, again, Malaya Lochnia, many mappers, reporters continue to insist that it's Ukrainian, under Ukrainian control, but Group of Forces North is telling us straightforwardly that it is controlled by the Russians. And they say over the course of a day, we repelled 2 attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces with a total of up to 60 troops in 5 armoured vehicles supported by a tank. During this, repulse of this attack, up to 25 enemy troops, 3 armoured vehicles, and the tank were destroyed, and a breakthrough was not allowed. So they're saying that the Ukrainians failed to capture Malaya Lochnia. They're also saying that in addition, the enemy continues to attempt to capture the village of Cherkaskoye Porechnoye. This is another village which many mappers continue to insist is under Ukrainian control. But again, Group of Forces North say that in fact it's the Russians who control it and the Ukrainians who are trying to capture it. And they say the enemy continues to attempts to capture the village of Cherkaskoye Porechnoye. It launched 1 attack with forces of up to a platoon of personnel. That would be about 30 men, as I understand, in 3 armoured vehicles. It had no success and retreated to its additional positions. Having suffered setbacks in the settlements of Ruskaya Konopelka and Ulanek, and as I understand it, Ruskaya Konopelka is also in this area of Malaya Lochnia, Cherkaskoye Porechnoye. I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly where all of these places are. And according to some Russian claims from Russian journalists, a Ukrainian attack on Ruskaya, this settlement of Ruskaya Konopelka, led to a very, very heavy defeat for the Ukrainians, but, I'm not going to dwell on that. Anyway, having suffered setbacks in the settlements of Ruskaya Konopelka and Ulanek is to the west of Suja. The enemy has shifted the direction of its attacks to the south, and with large forces of up to 50 troops and 6 armoured fighting vehicles, attacked the settlements of Borki and Spalnoye 3 times. Now, the Russians have confirmed a couple of days ago, about 2 days ago, that they've recaptured Spalnoye. But again, this report from Group of Forces North suggests that they also control the village of Borki, which, again, various mapping projects claim is under Ukrainian control. I believe that Borki was, for a time, under Ukrainian control, but it looks as if the Russians have recaptured it. Anyway, Group of Forces North then says all attacks were repelled by our fighters, no positions were lost, enemy losses are being clarified. And then they go on to say that the decrease in activity in the Korenovo direction, that's the area in the northwest, indicates that the enemy is regrouping in this area and amassing new forces to capture the administrative centre. The most intensive fighting will probably unfold here, and in the surrounding areas in the coming days. And then they continue with these rather extraordinary words. The modern Battle of Kursk continues, and our task is to withstand the onslaught of the enemy, go on the offensive and defeat him, as our grandfathers did in 1943. Then was a victory not only for the front, but also for the rear and for our entire people. And then they finish with the quote from Vyacheslav Molotov from the Second World War, victory will be ours. And then, amazingly, there's a quote from Lenin, no less. War must be waged for real or not waged at all. There can be no middle ground. That is a quote from Lenin. Anyway, there we go. Now, what they're saying is that they are doing exactly what the Soviet army, the Red Army, did in 1943 in Kursk. They're grinding the Ukrainians down. They're inflicting severe attrition on them. And once the Ukrainian forces in Kursk have been broken and depleted, then they plan to go on the attack themselves. Group of Forces North is planning its own offensive. And that was what happened following the Battle of Kursk in 1943. And it looks as if, according to Group of Forces North, that is what they're planning to do in 2024. We could very well see a Russian offensive in this area later in the year. Now, I will say, just to add, that there have been various claims, which I'm not sure that I necessarily think are correct, that in fact the Russians are already conducting some kind of offensive in the area of Sudzha, that they're advancing from the west towards Sudzha. This explains why villages like the villages of Spalnoye and Borki are presumably back under Russian control. And of course, the point that's been made is that Sudzha is the only significant logistics center that the Ukrainians have been able to capture in Kursk region. If the Ukrainians were to lose Sudzha, then supposedly their entire logistics operation in Kursk would collapse. That might very well be true. It could very well be that the advance towards Sudzha from the Russian advance towards Sudzha from the east westwards is indeed intended to do that. I'm not able to say myself. Again, we shall have to wait and see. My own view, for what it's worth, is that the Russian plan at the moment is still to confine the Ukrainians in this one area that they have around Sudzha itself, with some outlying villages in the area close to the border, rather than to, for the moment, push the Ukrainians wholly out of Kursk. As Group of Forces North say, the Ukrainians are suffering very heavy attrition in this area, and that works to the Russians' long-term advantage. That the time is on the Russian side, incidentally, is further confirmed by satellite photos that have now appeared, which show the scale of the defense systems that the Russians are creating in the north, in the area around the Kursk nuclear power plant and Kursk itself. The Ukrainians must be aware, in fact undoubtedly are aware, of the scale of these fortifications, which are now starting to acquire something of the strength and density of the Surovikin line in the south. And I think that the Ukrainians must realize that this all but excludes any serious possibility that they can push forward and capture the nuclear power plant itself. That in effect their offensive has already been stopped and has already failed. Now, just a few more things. Firstly, the Ukrainians have now published footage of drone attacks on Russian soldiers in the village of Olgovka near Korenovo. This particular village, again, most of the mapping projects have been showing under Ukrainian control for some time. As I have repeatedly pointed out, Group of Forces North has been reporting throughout as if this village is under Russian control. We now see that there are indeed Russian troops in this village. This appears to corroborate what Group of Forces North have been saying. I continue to take the view that the most reliable sources of information about what is going on, both in the Kharkiv and Kursk battlefronts, is what the Russian Defense Ministry and Group of Forces North are telling us. Anyway, the Russian Defense Ministry has also provided, as it always does, its account of what has been going on in Kursk, and I'll go to that briefly. They say that over the past 24 hours, units of Group of Forces North repelled attacks launched by enemy's assault detachments in the directions of Borki, Sparnoye, Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye, and Malaya Loknia. Again, that tallies exactly with what Group of Forces North have told us. They also say that the Ukrainians attempted to launch attacks in the direction of Komarovka. This is to the west. It's an attempted attack ultimately towards Korenovo, and Kremyanoye, which is more towards the north, towards the nuclear power station and towards Kursk itself. So the Ukrainians attempted to launch attacks in the direction of Komarovka and Kremyanoye. Ukrainian losses amounted to more than 60 troops killed and wounded. In addition, one tank, 7 armoured vehicles, 2 motor vehicles were destroyed, and 10 Ukrainian troops were captured. And the the Defense Ministry says that the Ukrainians made more attempts to send reconnaissance troops, but the Russians are keeping a close watch on this. And they say, that's the Defense Ministry, over the past 24 hours, Ukrainian losses amounted to more than 360 troops killed and wounded, 29 units of hardware destroyed, including 2 tanks, 3 infantry fighting vehicles, 2 armoured personnel carriers, and then various other pieces of equipment. And Ukrainian losses overall throughout the entire time period of the Kursk offensive now number 5,500 troops killed and wounded, 71 tanks, 30 infantry fighting vehicles, 57 armoured personnel carriers, and 11 multiple launch rocket system launchers, including 3 HIMARS systems. So there we are. Very heavy Ukrainian losses, and note, fighting continuing to take place for the same villages that we've been hearing about many times now. Malaya Loknia, the other places, Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye, Korenovo, Komarovka, Borki, Spalnoye. These are the same area, the bubble, as Grodivka described it, that the Ukrainians have established in Kursk, And so far, all their attempts to expand it failed, and they've not managed to capture anything of significance. Meanwhile, their major defense positions in Donbass continue to collapse. Now, as I've said already, I don't myself understand the logic of this any longer. There was a long, bitter statement by a former Ukrainian officer who appears to feel the same thing. He said some incredibly critical things about the conduct of the Ukrainian High Command, how the whole thing is all about trying to get publicity, and that he doesn't really have any other objective behind it. It's Kursk offensive is for likes and distraction. Ukraine's leadership did the operation in Kursk because everything is screwed up at the front and in the economy. The goal was to freak out everyone. The strategic goals of the invasion are unclear, and this was said by a Ukrainian officer who's identified as Dmitry Glushenko, who's described as an officer of the armed forces of Ukraine. There's actually a whole video of him giving his rather sour comments about the entire operation. And Julian Radke of Bild Zeitung, German journalist, appears as baffled by this whole operation as I am, and I've already spoken about how General Bradley Grodivka is also bewildered by it, and other military people are. Also, it seems an astonishing diversion of men and machines away from the main battlefront. But I've discussed at huge length the illogic of it, the difficulties I have understanding it in other programs, and I'm not going to repeat again what I said about it before. Just to make two final observations. This spasm of Ukrainian attacks, this flurry of drone attacks, the invasion on Kursk, the attacks on the ferry, which, as I said, has lost by now all military significance, the attempts maybe to stage some kind of operation on the Kinburn Spit and in other places. All of these look to me like gestures, attempts increasingly now by the Ukrainian leadership, by President Zelensky, to persuade themselves as much as everybody else that despite the fact that the war is now clearly being lost, Ukraine still retains energy, that it is still able to do things, to take action in various places, even as all the action that Ukraine is taking merely dissipates what energy is still left. It is, again, not very different from what happened in the case of Germany in the last few weeks of the war. Many people believe, by the way, that the Battle of the Bulge, the German offensive in the Ardennes, was the last offensive that the German army conducted in the Second World War. That is actually completely wrong. The Germans also launched a whole series of offensives on the Eastern Front in February and March 1945. They tried to recapture or retain control of certain oil fields in Hungary and Austria. They attempted to maintain control of the Austrian military-industrial complex. They committed significant forces to these operations, and the German leader apparently told his generals that he thought that these operations in Hungary in 1945 was so important that if these offensives succeeded, he would consider that an overall plus, even if in the meantime the Russians captured Berlin itself. And, well, there's lots of discussion and explanation and commentary and argument about what exactly it was that was motivating the Germans to launch this sudden spasm of offensive activity. By the way, in December 1944, even as everything was falling apart all around them, the Germans even managed to carry out a coup in Hungary and overthrow the Hungarian government and establish a pro-German government in Hungary with German troops involved in that operation as well. Anyway, many people have speculated what exactly it was that the Germans were up to in launching this cascade of ultimately futile counteroffensives. And again, my own view is that the German leadership, sensing that the war was just about to be lost, needed in some way, psychologically, to prove to themselves that they still had energy, that they still had force, that they could still take action to hurt their opponents, even as everything was collapsing around them. Maybe the leadership in Ukraine is thinking the same way. However, I think perhaps they also have some kind of rationale behind this. They're apparently again lobbying the United States heavily for permission to launch missile strikes deep inside Russia. There's a long piece about this in Politico, by the way, an interesting piece because it contains an admission that the ATACMS missile has proved rather less effective than had been expected, that the ATACMS has not been the great battle-changing missile that had been assumed. Anyway, the article says that the Americans are resisting these Ukrainian demands that ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadow missiles be used to attack air bases inside Russia. They make the point that the main air bases, where 90% of the Russian aircraft are located, are outside the range of these missiles anyway. So authorizing missile attacks on these air bases is not good, would not, in military terms, achieve anything. But it is probably the case that the Ukrainians are telling the Americans that without this permission to carry out these attacks, their offensive in Kursk is doomed, and that's why they need that permission. What they're probably still trying to do is to try to get their allies, the Americans and the Europeans, involved in the war in some way. This might be part of what is being said in Kiev to justify persisting with the Kursk operation. And they might be coming along and saying to themselves, well, if we can persuade the Americans to give the permission to launch deep strikes into Russia with missiles, well, that will goad the Russians finally to launch strikes of their own against us in a way, and maybe against our allies also, which in turn could broaden the war and could result in the war being won after all with the help of our American friends. Maybe this is the thinking, but I have to say it looks increasingly desperate. The Americans apparently at the moment are rejecting all of these demands. Probably they can work out for themselves what the Ukrainians are trying to do. And besides, it's unlikely now, given the trend of events, that the Russians are going to feel any need to take the bait. The Russians have said that they will retaliate against any Western military strikes on their territory. But they can do that now in all sorts of ways, by providing missiles to the Iranians, for example, or the Houthis, or anything of that kind. And they can do it at their own time and in their own place, because it's now clear that they're winning the war. So, and they don't have to, therefore, take further extreme steps in order to demonstrate that. From a Russian point of view, the capture of Pokrovsk is the single biggest blow they can inflict on the Ukrainians and on their Western allies. And for the moment at least, the battle in Kursk is playing out completely to their advantage. It is the gift which they might even say continues giving. Anyway, that is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.